Good morning to our viewers in the United States and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Thank you for joining us today. After weeks of speculation late last month, U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper announced the withdrawal of nearly 12,000 U.S. troops from Germany in an effort to bolster NATO and deter Russia. About 5,600 troops are slated to be redeployed to other countries in Europe, including Italy and Belgium and Poland, and 6,400 will return to the United States. The process might take years, leaving the United States with about 24,000 forces in Germany. This move will have a significant impact on the security of Europe and has the potential to change the dynamic of the German-American partnership. With us today to analyze the implications of the U.S. military drawdown in Germany is Paul-Anton Krüger, the deputy foreign editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Paul-Anton joined the Süddeutsche in 2005 after studying journalism in Berlin and Munich. He has been in his current role for nearly 2 years and has a special focus on the Middle East and international security. Previously, he was based in Cairo and served as the paper's correspondent covering the Arab world. In 2007, Paul-Anton was a guest editor at the Chicago Tribune as part of the Arthur F. Burns Fellowship Program. Paul-Anton, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning and good evening to our viewers, and thanks for the invitation.
Well, we are delighted to have you, and there's obviously a lot to talk about when it comes to this timely subject. And I'd like to start by maybe sharing with our viewers that late last week you had an opinion piece regarding the US military drawdown with the title, Ein Konzept, kein Plan, or a concept but no plan. In the article, you said that the US has firmly stated that it plans to withdraw 12,000 troops from Germany, but that it is not at all clear whether this will actually happen. So let's maybe begin by having you share your assessment with our viewers.
Yeah, thank you very much. The line that you just quoted is borrowed from the press briefing that the Pentagon held to explain the decision. And it was actually General Hyten, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who basically said, we have a concept, but we have no concrete plan yet, meaning that they are in the very early phase of making up the plans. And yeah, various commands, EUCOM and AFRICOM have announced that they start planning, but we all know that there's a presidential election approaching in the US quickly. There is pretty stiff resistance, and it's a cross-party matter. In the Congress, there is amendments in the Pentagon budget bill from the House. There is senators who made clear their opposition to the move in the recent hearing of Secretary Pompeo regarding the State Department budget. So I guess it will depend a lot on the outcome of the presidential election if these moves go forward or not.
Well, let me push you on that for just a moment, because in some of the analysis, it's said that the troop movements might take months to plan and years to execute. But Secretary Esper also said that some moves could begin, quote, within weeks. And I guess my question to you would be, from your standpoint, how realistic is that?
Well, there are probably certain units that you can move in a short amount of time, right? If you just have a few hundred people and you can move them to an already operating base that has additional space, there is no major reason to hold back on that. I think that COVID is another factor that has been or needs to be taken into account. That has been slowing planned troop rotations and movements all around the globe. On part of the US military and other militaries as well. So probably not a good time to speed up a process like this. We'll see what happens. I mean, when it comes to the major units and especially the command facilities that we're talking about, it's certain to take years. I mean, there are reasons that I could come up with to justify, for example, moving ICOM to Mons in Belgium, where we already have the military headquarters of the NATO forces that are supposed to keep Europe secure. But you will need to build a building there, you will need to build schools there, you will need to find flats, you'll need to find working or jobs for spouses that live overseas, and it's not a matter of days or months, but rather a matter of years to build that kind of infrastructure, and it's costly as well. And Congress will have a say in that, because one of the things that Congress is certainly looking for is the cost-benefit relationship.
And I think that's an important point, because obviously there are huge costs associated with this, not just the movement, but also with creating the infrastructure in the places where the troops would move in other communities and other cities. And so that has to be a factor as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for the US, there will be a big interest if really the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, so 4,500 or 4,000 soldiers who are now deployed in Germany, will go back to the States where they end up. And yeah, it's one thing that Secretary Esper and others have said that in the process they will always look at the well-being of the soldiers and their families, right? And this has to be taken care of, and that's not going to go overnight. And same goes for moving headquarters to Belgium or other places. I mean, you'll have to create all those facilities. With regard to Poland, I think Secretary Esper said that once the bilateral agreement between the US and Poland is ratified when it comes to cost sharing, they will look into building those facilities in Poland. So basically, we don't even have the legal foundations for that right now.
Paul-Anton, there have been different reports about why the president is focused on reducing the US military footprint in Germany. And some analysts have suggested that this move is about punishing Germany because it has not met the goal set by NATO member states in 2014 in Wales to spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. And so I'd like to hear from you a little bit about what the response or what the reaction has been by German officials to this news.
Well, by now it has been pretty much muted. There's different kind of reactions. I mean, there's the official reaction on part of Berlin, basically saying we regret that decision. And there was a letter written by the 4 prime ministers of the states that are most affected, where US troops are deployed, to the members of Congress, basically focusing on what we've achieved together, and that US military members have always liked serving in Germany, which is, I think, a factor that also should be taken into account. I mean, I don't know if they like Italy better because of the weather or whatever, but because of the historic relationship of Americans being deployed to Germany, there's really a close bond that developed over the decades. So yeah, I think the main reaction in Berlin is still let's wait for the election and see what happens then. The other thing is that it kind of stirred a domestic debate on various fronts. One is that there is quite some people in Germany, in the Bundestag and also in the government, who feel that Germany should do more and contribute more to the common defense of Europe. There is basically a dispute in the coalition government in Berlin about that. There have been suggestions to cut back on military cooperation with the US regarding 2 major projects that are upcoming. One is for heavy transport helicopters, which the Bundeswehr would need urgently. There's basically 2 projects, if I'm not mistaken, in the competition. Both are American-German corporations, and then there is the replacement of the Tornado fighter jets, where currently Germany is considering to buy F-18 from from the US and another tranche of Eurofighter Typhoon, where also another touchy subject comes in, namely nuclear sharing within NATO. So the American-built F-18 would guarantee that Germany would still kind of be part of the group of, or a small group of NATO member countries that are non-nuclear weapons powers and still have US nuclear weapons deployed on their territory, that in the case of war could be used through the German military in that case.
Well, can you maybe unpack sort of the internal debate for us a little bit, particularly around this military cooperation and the replacement of the Tornadoes for the F-18s, because it seems to have led to quite a debate within the Grand Coalition, as you indicated, with some SPD politicians and even some Green politicians saying, you know, gee, maybe we as Germany should rethink this deal with the United States, and other CDU politicians saying, no, we should continue to engage with the United States and engage with dialogue and continue with these plans for the F-18 fighters.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of nuclear sharing within NATO is a matter of debate ever since the head of the SPD parliamentary group, Mr. Mützenich, made the suggestion that the US nuclear weapons, we're talking about something like 20 gravity bombs that are stored at Büchel Air Base, should be withdrawn from Germany. It's not a new debate. We had the same debate when we had a black-yellow coalition in Berlin, and Guido Westerwelle as the foreign minister. He made an effort at the time convening colleagues from, if I remember correctly, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and that's probably it. Calling for the withdrawal of US tactical nuclear weapons from Europe. So this debate has come up again, and yeah, it also relates to the debate about the replacement of the Tornado fighter jet. The Tornado fighter jet has multiple roles in the German Air Force. It's an attack aircraft that is used for ground attack, which we also can see in Yemen, by the way, where the Saudis are using it in that role. It has a reconnaissance role, it has an electronic warfighting role, and it has the so-called nuclear or dual-capable aircraft role, which basically means that it would transport a US nuclear weapon after US president released it for warfighting into a target by a German fighter jet, right? And there is a debate about the replacement of these planes that are basically in service for 40 years now. And there are plans to use the Eurofighter for some of the roles, and for others, there's probably the need to buy something, right? And that is especially true for the dual-capable fighter jet role, because the jet or the aircraft that is used for that role needs to be certified by the US to be able to carry out that role. And that would be a very complicated and time-consuming process if one would try to achieve that with the Eurofighter or any other European-built aircraft. So the idea is to use an American-made aircraft. As far as I know, the F-18 is not being used in a nuclear role by the US military, but has been certified for that role previously, and on the grounds of assurances that were made by the US side, by the producer as well as the government, that process would probably go pretty quickly and smoothly. The other one is the electronic warfighting role, where probably the F-18 Growler is one of the most advanced aircraft that you can buy for that role in the current environment, and there is no competitor in Europe that is as developed or as well suited for that role either.
So, Paul-Anton, I'd also like to talk a little bit about the response from the Ministry of Defense itself. One of the articles that I read said that the Defense Minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, obviously said, this is a disappointing decision and is holding back in terms of whether it will actually happen or not, but has said that she and that Germany needs to focus more on European security policy if this decision goes ahead. And interestingly, her deputy, the Parliamentary State Secretary in the Defense Ministry, Thomas Ilberhorn, was in Washington as this news was breaking, and ended up having sort of quite a positive reception in the various places where he was having meetings with people. I guess the question I would have to you is what would this new European security policy look like? Are there any blueprints for that, or is it too early as people try to digest this news? But what do you make of the timing of this announcement with the State Secretary being in Washington at that time?
Well, that is rather a question for the Pentagon, I would say, right? So he received a pretty good red carpet treatment in Washington, I would say, for given his position in the government, right? So he was received in the White House, he was received in the Pentagon, had meeting with generals, had a lot of meetings with members of Congress and so forth. So that doesn't look to me as if the relationship was all that bad, that it might look if you only focus on the decision that basically was made by President Trump and driven by factors that probably are not only in the field of security policy, right? Yeah, when it comes to European defense policy, I mean, there has been a discussion about all this for decades. It has a component that is political, and there are differing views, for example, in Paris and in Berlin, what kind of role the European Union should play in defense matters. The German position so far has been that NATO is the core pillar of German defense policy, right? And I don't see any change in that, at least as long as this government is in place, right? The other one is a technological when it comes to hardware. There is clarity by now that there will be no fifth generation fighter jet, for example, produced in Europe if there's not a major cooperation among the leading European states, right? Same is probably true for other major weapon systems. And so there is a project mainly driven by France and Germany to develop a fifth generation fighter jet, which is more or less built as a flying platform. So it's not only about stealth, but it's also about networking, and a whole new type of air fighting capability. Same is true for a main battle tank. I mean, it's two fields where Germany has had its own producers in the past. So, I mean, the Tornado is a European aircraft already. Typhoon, Eurofighter Typhoon is a European aircraft. There's a famous Leopard main battle tank, but this is, I mean, we can also see it in the discussion that we're having now about the procurement, right? I mean, there's basically no German or European alternative if you want to buy a heavy transport helicopter by now. It doesn't exist. I mean, they're Russian, that we're probably not going to buy. And same is true for many other major weapon systems or logistic systems that will come up in the next couple of years, right? So if there's not, if we don't see any deepening in the cooperation on that regard in Europe, we'll probably be more dependent on the US or other foreign suppliers as we are right now.
So related to European security policy and to Franco-German initiatives, one of our viewers would like to know why Merkel has not responded to the proposal by Emmanuel Macron to form a sort of European army under the umbrella of NATO.
Well, I think she has kind of responded to that. As I said, I mean, the French have a slightly different view about what European defense should look like than the German government has given so far. Germany has always said that NATO is the most important pillar of German and European defense, and there is, I think, awareness in Berlin that this debate kind of has to move, but they also want to kind of avoid to build double structures or kind of put EU and NATO in a relationship where they kind of competing for resources or also kind of come up with competing policies. And there's, I would say, also some skepticism about Macron's true intentions, because we see that he rather has an activist foreign policy that some quarters in Germany see with, I wouldn't say dismay, but for example, if you look at Libya, it's not always that successful, right? So I think people want to avoid that a little bit. The interesting part that Germany has not responded to is that Macron, in his speech on 14th of, no, it wasn't the 14th of July, it was his speech in the École Militaire in Paris, where he basically offered a European dimension of the French deterrent, right? Mm-hmm. Which basically could mean a type of nuclear sharing agreement within Europe, which comes with a lot of problems if you look at it in more detail. But that certainly is a very interesting idea that the German government is not too keen to discuss.
So I'd like to maybe switch gears a little bit and talk about the economic consequences of all of this if this moves forward. As we were talking about before we started the call with everybody else, some of the bases that are slated for closure are in structurally weak regions. Of course, Stuttgart, which is the headquarters for both Europe and Africa, will also be affected by this. Can you talk a little bit about the economic consequences of this? And perhaps related to that, one of our viewers asks, what is or what will be the status of infrastructure in Germany, particularly places like Ramstein Air Force Base, Landstuhl Army Hospital, the Rhine-Main Air Base, the Army headquarters in Heidelberg, all of which have been very important for U.S. force projection in other parts of the world, and parts of the world that you know well from your previous reporting before you took on your current role.
Sure. One of the interesting things, or one of the things that stuck out to me when I was looking into the U.S. force structure in Germany is which units can you move, right? And what is basically infrastructure that you cannot replicate. And Ramstein, Landstuhl, and those places come up on the list that you cannot move easily. And I haven't heard anything that would make me think that anybody in the US is thinking about closing down Ramstein or Landstuhl or any of those places. So basically, the major infrastructure, US military infrastructure in Germany will go untouched by this. This might be even true for places that might be affected by the drawdown or withdrawal. So the commander of Spangdahlem Air Base, which is home to F-16 squadron that should be moved to Aviano in northern Italy, according to the plans, just recently over the weekend said that there are no plans to close down the airbase. So it might be there even if some of the F-16 jets and the maintenance crews, their pilots and related families move to Italy. It might still stay open as a backup for Ramstein, for example, or in the case that you need to rotate troops into the theater, into the European theater quickly. So that is a major function of Ramstein as well, right? I mean, it's a major logistical hub outside of the US, not only for Europe, but also for the CENTCOM region. Both of these installations will be affected in one way, namely that troops that were planning to rotate from Mildenham Air Force Base in the UK to Spangdahlem, so Special Forces troop to Spangdahlem, and air refueling to Ramstein will stay in the UK for the time being. I don't know exactly the military sense behind those decisions. I mean, yeah, you don't want to bring additional troops to Germany, but there was a reason to have this planning before, right? To consolidate probably troops in a place like Ramstein that you're planning to kind of keep up for the foreseeable future. For example, Spangdahlem, the US has invested something like 87 million in building new schools in the recent couple of years. There is investment in the billions, I think, over the last 10 years in Grafenwörth training area, which is unique in Europe. It's one of the few areas that allows live fire training, and I don't see this closing down. That being said, I mean, the withdrawal of 4,000 troops from Spangdahlem or 4,000 from Vilseck is a big loss for those communities, right? Because I mean, it's an economic factor, probably in the dozens of millions every year in those regions. There are Germans working for the American forces. There are US civilian employees of the Pentagon who are working there. So that all kind of factors into that. There are local companies supplying stuff to those bases. I don't know, renewing roof tiles or whatever, right? It's going to be probably a German craftsman who's going to go up that roof and do the work there. So it's a big loss for them. But it's also something, I mean, the German Defense Ministry has said that they will look into questions if they can move any Bundeswehr there, because I mean the troops are kind of growing again, so the numbers in the German army are going up recently, but there has been a consolidation process ever since the early 90s, right? When I was growing up pretty close to the former inter-German border, there were 300,000 Americans in Germany, and there were Belgians in the area of the country that I was living in. There were French soldiers, there were British soldiers. They all have gone back to their home countries now, and I mean, it's natural that the US looks at this force posture in Europe, and it's not kind of a done deal that it has to be 35,000 in Germany, right? I mean, there are probably reasons to move some of the troops out of Germany, but it's also kind of a matter of as I said, cost-benefit relationship. I mean, there's an agreement between the US and Germany that it makes it pretty cheap for American soldiers to be deployed in Germany. There is first-rate infrastructure. There have been problems in the past. If you look at the African command, I mean, that didn't come to Stuttgart because Stuttgart is so close to Africa. It came to Stuttgart because no Northern African state wanted to host it. And there was already infrastructure in place in Germany. For some other, you mentioned Stuttgart, for some other communities, it could even be a benefit, right? I mean, if you look at the barracks in Stuttgart, it's roughly twice the size of the largest development area that is being used to build new living quarters for people there. And you have areas like Stuttgart that are suffering from high rental prices, high real estate prices. And you wouldn't probably have a problem to develop that into something new.
So let me follow up directly with that. How has the mayor of Stuttgart, Fritz Kuhn, who's with the Green Party, reacted? And let me also fold in a viewer question that looks a little bit more to the future. How will a more green-oriented government, assuming that the Green Party makes it into the next government, approach U.S.-German military relations?
Well, that's a good question, because, as you know, the Green Party, from its founding, was a pacifist party, right? I think ever since we had a foreign minister from the Green Party, who was the one who was calling for the NATO intervention in the Balkans, also kind of looking back to German history. That is a different story, and what we are probably looking at is a green conservative or a Jamaica government rather than a red-red-green government. A red-red-green government, I think, would be something very different in terms of foreign and security policy, and but I don't see that in the current atmosphere. I mean, it's a long time to go until the elections, general elections. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID. We don't know what the Conservative Party, so Mrs. Merkel's CDU, will be doing. So they are looking for a new party leadership and a candidate for replacing Ms. Merkel, and nobody knows what the electorate will say to that, right? So I mean, it's a long time to go.
So there have been a couple questions that we've gotten from some viewers via email and on the chat function about the overarching strategic implications of the move. One person wrote that obviously U.S. troops were posted to Germany because it was a frontline state and they're not needed in Germany anymore, so why not move the troops to Poland? Someone else would like to know about the strategic implications of the move for similar reasons. And I guess, you know, the question that poses itself right now is who could benefit from this move? Secretary Esper stated that the recent announcement will deter Russia, but he's not really outlined how that's been the case. And that's something that needs to be explained as well.
Yeah, so various things. It's one of the things that also Secretary Pompeo mentioned in his hearing in the Congress, that Germany is not a frontline state anymore, right? And there is President Trump basically saying we are protecting Germany or guaranteeing the security of Germany, and they are not paying their fair share. Yeah, well, I would agree that we're not paying our fair share because, I mean, the government pledged to spend 2% on defense back in 2014, and one of the parties that is now opposing it from within the government was part of the government at that time, right? I would always criticize that. When it comes to strategic reasons, I have a hard time understanding how redeploying a major combat brigade, Army Combat Brigade, to the US is enhancing deterrence of Russia, because it was moved back into Germany after the invasion of Crimea by Russia. It had been relocated to the US before by the Obama government. So in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, the Obama government withdrew 2 of the 4 heavy combat army brigades from Europe back to the US, and then redeployed what is now the 2nd Cavalry Regiment of the Army, a Stryker Brigade, to Germany in reaction of that Russian move and to enhance the deterrence. The thing is, you cannot place that unit permanently into Poland, at least not if you kind of care about the and I don't know the English term for that, NATO Russland Grundakte.
Oh,
I think it's a foundational act. I mean, it's an an agreement between between NATO and Russia, going back to the end of the Cold War and the Warsaw Pact, which basically says that no major combat units will be deployed to former members of the Warsaw Pact, right? I mean, given the way that the Trump government has been dealing with arms control agreements in the past, you could come up and kind of just scrap this document. I would say that there will be very strong resistance in Europe against doing this, even in the countries that are now hoping for US troops being deployed there. So Poland and the Baltic countries, right? So you're not going to put major combat units in there. There have been, for example, the Striker Brigade from Germany has been rotating troops into Poland on a regular basis, and there are troops going to the Baltics from Germany as well. The consequence of all that will be that you will have to do the logistics from the US. So you'll have to redeploy them from the US for 3 or 6 months to Poland, and you put a headquarter into Poland that does not kind of fall under that definition of major combat unit, and you have a political symbol strengthening the defense of Poland towards Russia. So you can do that. If it makes sense in terms of security or in terms of cost benefit, I would doubt that, right? When it comes to the F-16, which is the other major unit that might be affected, you put them into Italy. The official reasoning was it's closer to the Black Sea region, and the Black Sea region, or the southeastern flank of NATO, is not at the same status that the northeastern flank is right now. So if you redeploy forces there, that probably is under or in a strategic context that makes sense. When it comes to that special unit, I would kind of, I'm not really that much a military expert that I really can answer it. I mean, what I learned is that the major, or the outstanding thing about the F-16s in Spangdahlem is that they are kind of supposed to be used in enemy air defense suppression. And they are basically the only US Air Force unit in Europe that is suitable for that task. And that is something that I would rather see in the Baltics or in the northeastern flank of NATO rather than in the southeastern. But yeah, there will be some planning behind that, I guess.
So, Paul-Anton, I'd like to ask you a little bit about public opinion in Germany, to the degree that you can respond to this. We've got a couple of questions from people who would like to know, on the one hand, whether the German public would be relaxed about a U.S. withdrawal from Germany, but also from someone else, whether this move is perceived by Germans as a weakness by the United States.
Well, I think there is a mixture of reactions, right? I mean, if I look at what we get on social media and letters from readers that we receive, and also some of the opinion polls that I've been reading, there's a regret, especially in the regions that are heavily affected. There is kind of the feeling that it's an unfair punishment. That, I think, is also kind of reflected in some levels of government, at least. And Senator Romney in the Pompeo hearing referred to that he has been told by his level of German government that they consider it to be an insult. And for many Germans, I think it just comes as a confirmation of their view of President Trump, which is not very favorable in the majority of German population.
So let me fold in 2 or 3 more questions here too, because one of our viewers is curious about whether or not this move creates a power vacuum in Germany, and whether or not that can be filled by the Bundeswehr. Someone else points out that the the Bundeswehr is in very difficult situation with an unready and unprepared armed force that needs more capability in order to defend the country, and whether this is the moment to try to rebuild the German military, but also what are leaders within the Bundeswehr saying about this decision?
Yeah, several components to that, right? I mean, as I said before, the U.S. troops that are stationed or deployed in Germany are not here in the first place to defend Germany itself, right? So the Striker Brigade especially was redeployed to Europe to serve in emergencies like the one that was Crimea, should it recur, say, in the Balkans or in Poland, right? These are units that are kind of quickly deployed because there's a Striker can be airlifted anywhere. So it was basically a quick reaction force, and withdrawing it from Europe or kind of redeploying it to the US will cut the fighting power of US land forces by roughly 1/3, right? Because of one of 3 brigades that are in Europe, and I don't see them primarily in a role to defend Germany. Same is probably true for the F-16 and the special role they have that I just described, that are deployed to Spangdahlem. I would certainly agree that the Bundeswehr has some major problems when it comes to their heavy equipment, and it's something that has been acknowledged by the German government by now. The restructuring of the Bundeswehr is ongoing and is also a priority. Interesting question will it remain a priority, especially in a new government and under the given economic situation? One of the ironies of the whole situation might be that we end up having a higher percentage of the 2%, because the economy in Germany is also suffering because of COVID, right? So if our economy loses roughly 10% of its GDP over the year, and defense expenditures are the same, then it will go up to something like 1.6 or 1.7% from 1.4 where we are now, right? So that kind of also gives you an idea that probably the measurement or the 2% thing is not a very good indicator of how much a country is doing to modernize its defense.
Well, in that sense, it's important also to point out that in recent years, Germany has increased its defense spending, albeit not as a percentage of GDP, but in actual numbers.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that both countries that troops are supposed to go to, namely Belgium and Italy, spend less on defense per capita than Germany. So yeah, when it comes to punishing Germany for not spending enough on defense, that kind of probably needs a little rebrush, but there are not that many other countries that you can send those forces to, right?
Well, let me be maybe a little provocative. Do you think that this move could sort of be a ploy to get Germany to boost its defense spending more quickly?
I don't think so. Rather, I mean, you can see some of the reactions are basically saying, you cannot treat a historic and close ally like this, and we're not kind of to be bullied around, and we should reconsider our defense cooperation with the US, right? So it rather goes in the opposite direction, which is kind of childish as well if you don't have any alternative, right? It's not that we're doing or we're buying heavy transport helicopters in the US because we want to do the US a favor. It's because the Bundeswehr needs them, and there's no European supplier that can supply them. So I don't know. I mean, this is kind of campaign rhetorics and appealing to some political constituencies, but has nothing to do with security policy, I think.
I'm sure that a number of people on this call are very curious about Douglas Macgregor, who's been nominated as ambassador in Berlin. And of course, he has a significant military background. And I think some thoughts might be that he's been chosen for this position to sort of manage this transition. But do you have any thoughts, or what are you hearing about him as a potential new US ambassador to Germany?
Well, my first reaction would be that he has to be confirmed by Senate, and let's see if this is going to happen up until the election or not, or if we're going to see someone else. And then when it comes to the process, I think it's something that the State Department and the Pentagon will be in close conversation about with their German counterparts. I have no doubt about that. I mean, if you talk to people who are kind of in the process and even high levels of the Pentagon, there's not that grudge that seems to drive this this decision by President Trump and some others, like the former U.S. ambassador to Germany, who apparently played a big role in that, Rick Grinnell. And I think it's just too early to say if he was chosen on those grounds. I mean, he has been very vocal and outspoken about withdrawing troops. He has been criticizing the campaign in Afghanistan. He has been very critical about the U.S. presence in the Middle East, and he's a frequent speaker on President Trump's preferred TV channels. So that might have all contributed to him being picked for that posting. He apparently was also in the circle of people being considered for the post of the National Security Advisor. But yeah, if he comes to Germany, I guess he will be welcomed like any other German ambassador has been welcomed here. And I think the German government at least would be very keen to have a full ambassador or fully working embassy, and kind of try to work with the U.S. government as closely as possible.
Paul-Anton, there has been a lot of criticism, both in Germany but also here in the U.S. about this proposal, whether it be from the U.S. government or from military leaders. And there have been a number of our viewers who, in essence, have asked the same question, which is, can this decision be stalled or stopped somehow? And although it's hard to know exactly what will happen in November, given the amount of time that it would take to actually implement this drawdown, what are your thoughts on whether this will actually happen? So coming full circle in a sense from where we started, do you think that this is something that will actually take place, or is it just something that's sort of distracting everybody right now in the run-up to the election?
Well, I think if President Trump is being confirmed for a second term, there is no way to get around it, right? I mean, it might take years, but the most how should I say? The thing is that he basically set the limit of U.S. troops in Germany to 25,000, right? And if you want to go down to that number, taking into account that you'll still have to rotate certain troops through Germany to get them to other places, there's probably no other way of doing it than what the Pentagon has announced, right? I mean, these are the two major units that you can move easily, or more or less easily. So they picked those, and they picked the two headquarters, AFRICOM and but when it comes to AFRICOM, it hasn't even been announced where it could go. It could go to Italy, could go to Spain, could even go back to the US. When it comes to EUCOM, it could go to Belgium, right? There have been, I think, 3 former EUCOM commanders by now warning against moving those headquarters, because they are saying, okay, if you move them to a new place, it's going to disrupt their operation. It's going to affect the state of readiness of US forces in Europe, la la la. So it's not going to be an easy task. The 2 others, I think, will happen if the president gets reelected. If he doesn't get reelected, I think everything is going to be in hold and will be re-evaluated. Which doesn't mean that we're going to end up having 36,000 US soldiers in the end in Germany, right? There's a regularly scheduled process looking into the US force posture, not only in Europe, also in other parts of the world. And it's nothing new or specific to the Trump administration. There is what Obama called the pivot to Asia. It's because I think bipartisan China is seen as the most severe challenge for the US, and this will probably come with a stronger focus on Asia. There is, even in a democratic administration, no big appetite for an extended engagement in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, where Germany has been serving as hub for troops there. So if you draw down in the Middle East, you're still probably gonna end up reducing some of your forces or your infrastructure that has been in Germany for decades now. So I wouldn't say if he loses the election, this is going to be reconsidered and probably not carried out as planned by now, because this is all driven by the directive of the president to draw down to 25,000 in US troops in Germany, right? If you go through this again, for example, I would consider that someone has made up his mind before deciding to put the air refueling into Ramstein and the special forces with their Osprey into Spangdahlem. It was not because there's a grudge against the British, right? There's some strategic reason behind that. This is a decision that has been reversed now, and that basically shows you that there is reason to look into this again. And I think also in the military leadership, not everybody is convinced that this is the wisest choice, but as they are military, they're going to carry out the political guidance that they're getting from the White House and from the Pentagon, and do the necessary planning to relocate troops. And there are kind of, I think, various steps in that process where you can still hit a push or push a stop button and kind of basically terminate the process.
Well, Paul-Anton, this is obviously a developing story, if you will, and as you rightly point out, there are a lot of different factors that will ultimately influence the final decision. Not least of which is that I think there's, even some thought that if the president is reelected, that even within Congress, for example, on the Republican side, there are people who are opposed to this move, and that this is something that may change, but we will have to see, and we will have to keep following this.
Yeah, and as I wrote in my opinion piece, probably the withdrawal of some 10,000 or 12,000 troops from Germany will probably not be the biggest issue that we're going to have in our bilateral relations if the president gets reelected, right? I mean, you just had John Bolton warning that he could really pull out the US from NATO. That would be on a total different scheme or dimension, yeah. And I mean, if you look at, we also reported that basically the view of the German government and also the most of the NATO allies is they're not happy with relocating the Stryker Brigade to the US because they feel that kind of is not contributing to the deterrence of Russia. But in general, I think the idea is that it does not endanger, the whole move does not endanger the defense of Europe or the defense of Germany.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating hour with you. I want to thank you again for sharing your thoughts on what's going on when it comes to the military drawdown. And it's certainly something that we will be watching in the weeks, months, and possibly years to come. So Paul-Anton, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This has been very informative for us all.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and yeah, let's see what happens.
Well, we look forward to staying in touch with you, and to you and also to our viewers, stay healthy in this uncertain time. Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye.